G'day there, you're watching the Aussie BIM Guru, and today on the channel I've got a second demonstration video showing myself using the platform Toric. I did have a video previously that showed a more complex workflow using this system, but I do want to show you a more simple workflow that is focused on also looking at the model using a model viewer. Now, if you didn't see my previous video, Toric is a North American company that focuses on data visualization using the web. They also offer a visual coding platform, which is quite similar to other platforms like Grasshopper and Dynamo, and how you can construct a workflow. It's really promising, and I think that it's going to be one of the lead platforms that could potentially show us how we can process and manage data from a lot of different data sources in the web. So I hope you find this demonstration interesting, and if you do want to find out more, do reach out to the team at Toric as well. Anyway, let's get started. So I have a project here that's a little bit messy. People have been a little bit careless in the model, which is quite common. People are in a rush heading for deadlines. If I have a look at the Manage Warnings tab, I'll find that I have quite a lot of warnings in the model that relate to lots of different things. In this case, I actually have about 800, which, crazy to say, is actually a fairly small number compared to the number of warnings we usually see. Some warnings are not a big problem and other ones are actually of concern. For example, sometimes there are warnings about stairs not reaching the top of where they're intended to go. This is often an indication that the stair may not actually be compliant to the DDA standards or the accessibility standards. So for example, I might have something saying that a room is not actually enclosed, which means it doesn't report its area, and we might actually have briefed discrepancies if we rely on a room schedule from the model. So we do have to be very careful with these things. Often we do review these warnings using a variety of custom applications or often more manual methods. But in this case, I'm going to use Toric to construct a report about the warnings that someone could use to form high-level actions or insights about the state of the model. So in this case, I'm just going to begin my workflow by opening the Toric app and actually exporting to Toric. So in this case, I will actually have to log in. So I think I've already logged in. There we go. So in this case, I am going to direct towards a particular project intended for demonstration, and I am creating a new data source, but if I was creating a new version, it would recognize this data source already exists. Now I'm going to use a 3D model viewer in order to actually see what is going on in the model as well. So in the send options, I'm going to make sure I've actually toggled 3D export. I'm going to make sure I'm sending all the objects that could potentially relate to warnings and also the warnings themselves. I don't really need the views because I can't see them in 3D. And I'm also going to send my warnings as well. And I'm going to send data to Toric. Now this usually takes a few minutes depending on the type of model. This is a roughly 250 megabyte model. So in my experience, it usually takes about 3 to 5 minutes. But I guess in the meantime, I might show another workflow that I built using Toric to assess model health. This is a slightly more complicated workflow, so I'm probably not going to show it in detail. I'm going to focus just on warnings, but I've built a data flow here that effectively targets a lot of different things in a model. Now it's quite complex. It has a lot of connections, things that it's measuring, but effectively the goal is to provide a dashboard to the user that reports on metrics. And I'm really just showing you this so that you can see something while you wait for the model to export. If I have a look at the report I've constructed using Toric, I can actually, in this case, analyze various components using a dial metric. So I can see the weight of issues. And this helps me really quickly visually identify the key problems that the model is likely presented with. The dials in this case give you the option to set a constant value for minimum, maximum, target, and then you can feed in a value from Toric to assess an actual outcome. So I can see I'm measuring things such as loadable system and system families that are missing a company approved prefix, which means they probably aren't from the company standard. Some don't have classification codes, so they won't comply to a classification standard. There are some families that are potentially copies of each other because they have a 1 after their name. And I've also created some more detailed tables where people can review things. For example, we can see 3 families with the same name, except the only difference being a number. So this is an example of a more thorough health check you could do with Toric, but today we're going to focus on a much more simple report, just so you can see a slightly more simple thing you could set up in Toric more quickly. You can see at the moment it's still exporting most of the geometry. I do have a few thousand mullions in this model, so as a result, it's going to take just a little while to get through those. But the goal once we finish here is to create a report that has both a model viewer, gives the user the ability to pick a warning type to focus on in that model viewer, and also report the elements that are related to those warnings and the levels that they are based on, which is all possible in Toric, and typically would be quite difficult to build as an application, especially with a model viewer. So it seems like it's just getting through the mullions now. The railings, there we go. I find the mullions usually seem to take the longest because there's so many of them. There's a curtain facade around the majority of this hotel model that you can see in the background over here. So most of those facades have curtain glass and panels. But I do like to keep in this process of using an application when I show it, just to give a true representation of the time involved in various steps of the process of using it. But you can see it's fairly quick at collecting the remainder of that data. It's now just converting the geometry for the 3D model viewer, so there would be a lot less to send to Toric if we didn't have to do the 3D geometry as well. But I usually like to do that so there is a 3D model viewer available in the dashboard if we want to use one. But once this is sent up to Toric, I can log into my account and access the project and begin to build a data flow using this as a model source. So I think it's almost finished. So I should find now if I go to Toric in this case, and I'll just do a refresh on this page, we should now have that available as a data source in this particular project that I've uploaded it to. So in this case, I do have an audit copy of this particular model I'm working from, which I've intentionally messed up a little bit. And there we go, we can see the model is available here. So let's create a data flow. In this case, I'm going to create just a new blank data flow. And the goal here is to generate a warnings report. So I'm in this case just going to firstly rename my workflow to warnings report. Now, if you haven't seen my other video on Toric, just a very quick guide to the user interface, but I do recommend you watch my other previous video for a more detailed description. So we have various areas of Toric we can work with. First of all, we have the canvas, which is both a data inspector, a data flow where we build our workflow, and we can also build applications. So we are going to build one which is going to be the actual report and model viewer. So I'm going to come back to this one once my data flow is in a pretty good state and ready to be visualized. So we're going to begin with our data flow. Now I'm going to close this properties window and switch to a split interface, which I much prefer because it lets us inspect our data in a tabular format, but also view our data flow on the side. And I usually do close the overview once I've created my data source. So if I go to sources, I can now in this case take my audit copy as a source, and there's my Revit model. And I'm going to make sure I'm using the latest version dynamically, which is usually the default. So that means if I upload new sources, I will see the latest information about the model. I'm going to pick in this case two types of elements. I'm going to firstly take warnings, but I'm also going to take levels as well, because I'm going to want to figure out later on which levels these warnings belong to. Now, I'm going to have to filter the data down now because I have both levels and warnings, but I want warnings on one side, levels on the other. Now, I could create two data sources, but the problem is that these aren't connected to each other. So I want to start from one single data source node. So in this case, I'm firstly going to filter. And I'm firstly going to use a property that only a warning could have to use the filtering criteria. And the reason why I'm doing that is because I can't use element type. Because element type in this case, in a warning in Toric, is actually going to be the object that relates to that warning instead. So what I'm actually going to do is pick something like warning description and say that it has to be not empty, because a warning will always have a description of some sort. At this point, I've broken down my model warnings. Now, it's important to understand in Toric that the warnings aren't necessarily one object. What we're seeing is each object involved in a warning as it relates to one. So we're never going to get quite the absolute number of warnings. If you wanted to do an approximation, you could on average estimate that probably when you factor in that some warnings relate to one object, some warnings relate to multiple objects, and most warnings relate to two, the warning count in this case divided by 2 would be roughly your nominal warning count in the model. Now, of course, that's not entirely true, but in most cases I found it's a good rule of thumb to apply in such a workflow. So we can see currently we have about 1,500 warnings. However, in Revit, the warning object count is actually closer to about half of that, 782. Sometimes warnings relate to one object, sometimes they relate to many, and sometimes they relate to, in this case, pairs of objects. So I found it's just a rule of thumb. It's up to you whether you want to even show the current warning count. Up to you, of course. But in this case, I found that's one way you can at least determine a nominal number of likely warnings to exist in the model. So in this case, what I can do is count the number of things, and then I can just divide this by 2 to form a nominal count in this case. So I'm going to search for a number input and set that to 2. Now, of course, it's not an absolute method. It's really more like an aid for someone viewing the data set. So they do need to understand sort of how their data works in that scenario. But for now, I haven't found necessarily a way to do the precise number of actual warning objects. Having said that, it could totally be added in the future, I'm sure. So we're going to move on now and also break out some key data. So I'm going to use breakout to nominate just the columns I'm interested in. So first of all, I'm going to take a few pretty obvious ones like warning description, the element type that is involved with the warning. So in this case, what is it? And we can also take, in this case, the level ID of that object, which typically in most cases should return a relevant level. It doesn't always, depending on how the object is hosted. But for a majority of them, I find it can find the level in most cases. I'm also going to get the ID of the element involved with the warning so that we can always find that object back in the Revit model if we are viewing the report in Toric next to Revit as well. So in this case, I have a fairly good set of data. Now we need to convert this level ID into an actual level. In this case, this is why I've actually got levels back here. So I'm going to copy and paste this filter and effectively just reverse the criteria that I'm using. So in this case, I will say that the warning description is empty. I'm now going to break out just a couple of fields in this case. So I need the ID of the level, which in this case is actually going to be its element ID, and then also its name as well as a built-in parameter. And I can use this ID to effectively map as many as possible of those level IDs in my other data set to their equivalent level name. To do this, I'm going to use what's called the join node. So I'm going to take the levels on one side and my data on the other. And to the right, I'm going to want to match in column A the element ID of the level to the level ID on side 2. And I should find on the right of my data set, where possible, it has actually found the associated level of the object involved in that particular warning. So now we have a much more meaningful piece of data that we can use to inform our data set. So for the next step, we now actually want to focus on building our warnings report. So I might actually at this point just focus on getting some key data. But first of all, I might just remove some columns that we no longer need. So in this case, we know we're not going to need, we don't really need the level ID anymore. We probably need everything else. And I might also just reorder some columns. And I'm probably going to firstly put my, I don't know which one I'd want to put first. It's hard to say. You could put the warning description first, but I might put the warning description last and group my warnings by their description instead. So I'm going to take my element type first to see what the warning relates to. I'll take the element ID after the element type. And I'll take my level after that, which is currently called built-in parameter name. So we might want to change that as well, just so the user understands what that piece of data actually is. And then right at the end, I'm going to put my warning description. I'm then going to rename some of these columns. They're not necessarily the most human readable names at the moment. So for now, I'll keep element type as it is. I could maybe call it category, because I guess people probably understand it as category more clearly. I can say element ID, level name, and finally, after this, we have the description. I'll just, in this case, call it warning type. And now we have more human readable names in this case for all those things. So now that we've got these objects and we've renamed them, all we really need to do is group our warnings by type. And we end up with a data table that is much more neatly organized by the type of warning, by the objects related to them, also the elements ID and level, and also the description of the warning is still on the end, but probably the last thing we really need to see because it is still at the top of the table as well. So at this point, we can go and build a data report. I might also just count the number of unique warning types as well. So in this case, all I have to do is just count my groups, I believe. So actually that gives me the count of objects, which probably isn't quite what we're looking for at the moment. We're probably looking in this case for, we can count these things in different ways actually. What I could do is ungroup my data. I'm not sure if that's the best way. No, I think what I'll do instead is I'll count the number of unique values. So I'll use the count unique node for this set of data. And I'll count the number of unique values in the warning type. Now in this case, it looks like it's actually counting them by warning type, which is quite useful. But what I can also do after this is just count the number of rows in that table to see that I have 21 types of warnings currently in the model, or objects associated as a pair or a set with warnings. So in this case, some of these will actually relate to how many objects are involved with those warnings instead. As we'd expect, this is probably double because it's highlighted walls overlap, so it's 2 objects. Identical instances in the same place, we're probably getting obviously warnings with multiple objects associated to them because we have multiple elements on top of each other. So we're going to get variable counts of warnings in this case. But at this point, we really have an indication of how many elements are involved in these particular warnings at least, and then how many warning types there are. So let's begin building a data report in this case. So I'm probably just going to begin by, in this case, adding a model. So I'm just trying to think of the best way to do this, because I probably need to also add a filter to nominate which types of warnings I actually want to focus on. But in this case, what I'll first do is add a model viewer. Here we go, which lets us actually point to our model. Now there's various ways that I can point to this model. I might for now just take my data at a certain point before I filter it, maybe here. Now I think in this case I might need to actually point to the source. So I might need to tell this to be the model viewer. There we go. So I have a typical view cube. I can zoom, I can pan around, I can move. Just trying to remember the various controls. So I think if I remember right, it's left click to orbit, and then you hold down, or you just scroll the wheel, and then you can hold down control to pan. And what I usually like to do is set a home view, so that if I do get away from my home view, I can just go home. There we go, perfect. Now at the moment I can see we are just looking at the objects, in this case, that are associated with warnings specifically in the overall model. So I am curious, I guess we can actually filter this, which we'll look at, but I will need an additional component to do that. Now we can also place other objects on the canvas as well. For example, the nominal number of warnings could be shown as a scorecard, and I'm going to bring my properties window up and just say nominal warning count estimated. So it's obviously not a precise warning count because we are actually counting the number of objects specifically associated with warnings explicitly. So in this case, what I can also do is probably show this as well. I can also say with duplicates. I could always do a unique count by element ID as well. So maybe I can do that too. I can probably do a unique count. So I'm going to find a unique count by element ID, and that will literally tell me how many unique elements are involved with a warning. And I might do it after I've broken out my data so it's smaller. By element ID, and then all I have to do from here is count. count how many objects I believe. I'll just go back to my data inspector. So we have 1, 1, 1. No, so we still end up with the majority of the elements in the model, which is quite interesting. So not 100% sure how it is actually dealing with those particular element IDs at this point. That's quite interesting. Might have to play with this a bit further to find out exactly how it's estimating those numbers. But for now, I'll just keep my nominal warning count and my actual count of objects involved with warnings for now. From here, I'm going to take my table, which I've grouped over here, and I'm going to place this on my report as a table, so I can actually view these particular warning types. Now, at the moment, I'm not actually focusing on the number of warnings by type. What I can actually do is filter my data downward. So I have to go back to a stage where I was filtering. And what I might do is filter at a preliminary stage in the workflow. And at this point, I might filter while I'm still dealing with explicit Revit objects. And I'm now going to have to modify the data type of the warning description, because at the moment it's actually in text, which won't let us filter. So we need to actually make this a special type of data. So I'm going to, in this case, say that I want to use the warning description, but I'm going to change its type to multi-select. And if I look in the data inspector, I can see now I have this bubble around it, which means it understands it can be used for filtering, which means it also appreciates that some of these fields will be the same in different rows. So we want to filter just by selecting one of those options rather than doing it row by row. So what I'm going to do now is introduce another filter, but we're going to do a little bit of a special filter for this one. So I'm going to filter by the warning description, which is now multi-select, but I'm going to say in this case has any of, which supports a multi-selection scenario. I'm now in this case going to take this filter, drag it onto my report as a drop-down, and I'm just for now going to pick maybe a couple of warning types. And now my output, I'm going to connect to the model viewer, and we can see now instead we get a filtered version of the model instead. We still see the base model that's not currently being focused on, but in this case we do also see the objects related to those warnings highlighted. I'm going to go to properties, and in this case you can color by something as well. So I can color by model, or I can also color by warning description. We can also select a transparency model in this case, so you can tell the model just not to appear at all. But in this case, I can also just experiment with a few different types of colors. Usually I like element type because I find that that actually does tend to give you a better idea of what types of objects you're looking at. For example, now I can really clearly tell which things are rooms because they're the same color. But otherwise, that's pretty much it. At this point, we have a pretty robust warning report. So if I do, in this case, just select none, notice my table is also responsive to what I nominate now. So I can just focus on a small amount of elements at the same time. I could, of course, filter and then do a tally as well if I wanted to. So if I'd rather see the warnings I'm focusing on, I can also make this happen after the filter. And then we can see instead we get a filtered representation of the warnings as well. So I think it's quite a compelling visual. I think let's just focus on, say, rooms, for example. Multiple rooms are in the same enclosed region. And we can really quickly tell where a majority of our rooms are located in the model. We could also do a bar chart to represent where a majority of the warnings are located. So in this case, what I could do is generate a chart after our table. And I'll make it a bar chart. And in its properties, we're going to measure this by level. So we'll say in this case, warning count by level. The dimension, in this case, we're going to be using the level name. And the measurement in this case, again, is going to be the level name. And we're just going by sum, I believe. No, we're going by count. And in this case, we can see more or less where a majority of these warnings are focused. If I just make that a little bit bigger, we can see in this case we have a fairly even distribution of warnings on that particular level. But if we say all, to see all of our warnings at the same time, we can see a majority of our warnings are focused around the level 5 area. In fact, this might actually be a more valuable metric to bring further up our chart. So we might actually have more value if we put this on top. And notice that all my reports are dynamically changing. as I put these in here. I might actually try to tell this that it actually belongs in a full line. There we go. And we've got a really effective report here, I think. It's quite a handy one. If I wanted to, I could just put this next to my selection, and maybe we don't do a nominal warning count. We just look at the number of rough elements involved. But at this point, I want to be able to share this with someone. So what I'm going to do is create a data app that can be shared with other people. So I'm going to make a data app by saying, in this case, I believe share. Yep. And I'm going to enable a shared link. I'm also going to publish this app to my own home area in Toric. And that way I can also see and share the app from my home area. So at this point, I should have a new app in home called warning report / viewer. So let's go back to Toric. I'm going to go to my apps. And I should now have a visitable link that is also shareable. Interesting. Something went wrong. Always the challenge of working with the web. I guess you do get occasionally issues with the Australian internet probably. So I'm just going to go back to apps. There we go. This time it's happy. And there's our warning report viewer. It tells us the project it's related to as well. And if I do share this with someone, they'll see something that looks a little bit like what's going to load. It'll take a little bit longer just because it does have a 3D model viewer. But having said that, it's very quick compared to most similar products that do offer model viewers. I can now really see that concentration of warnings based on level 5. I can just adjust column widths to view more information. I can see the warning types, but I can also see what types of elements are involved with them. And I can also see the levels and the element IDs that I can then track back in the Revit model specifically. So let's just filter down just a little bit. And we can see that everything updates. I'm just going to look at rooms not properly enclosed and multiple rooms in the same enclosed location. And we can start to really see in our model viewer where most of these are concentrated. I can see most of them are actually occurring in this case. It looks like level 3, no, level 2 in this case actually. So I can see someone's probably been doing some replanning in this area, which allows me to then get people in the model to check these things without me having to open the model. If I'm a model manager, say I'm in a meeting and I just want to check the status of a model, I request my team push to Toric and there it is for me. So it's a really compelling and useful little app that I've also been experimenting with other applications for. The 3D model viewer can be used in many interesting ways, but I hope it was an interesting use case for Toric using a common audit target that we use in Revit typically. So there you have it. We now have a very useful set of auditing tools available to us in the web, on device or computer, whenever we want, as long as someone pushes the data source at a reliable time. It's pretty amazing what this platform can actually achieve, and as always, our creativity is really our only limit. Having said that, there are new features coming in the platform all the time. It's a great team, so I do recommend definitely reaching out to them if you'd like to see more or have your own customized demonstration. And I look forward to seeing what they can do in the future, and also what I can do with the platform as well. If you're not already following and subscribing, feel free to do so, and I look forward to seeing you in similar future videos. Thanks, take care.